a real scientist, not a YouTuber, not a weekend monster hunter, but a Harvard-trained biologist who ran the research division of a major Amazon museum, went on the record with a claim that should have ended his career. He said Brazil's Bigfoot is real. And he said it isn't an ape at all. He said it's an Ice Age monster, a giant beast the textbooks swear died out with the mammoths, and that it never actually went extinct. The locals call it the Mapinguari. If he was right, it would have been the biggest zoological discovery in 100 years. Most scientists spend their whole careers avoiding the word monster. This one built a decade around it, so either one of the most credentialed naturalists in the Amazon quietly lost his grip on reality, or he saw something the rest of us refused to look at. And he didn't just write it up and move on. He mounted around 10 expeditions into the rainforest. He gathered more than 100 eyewitness accounts. He tracked down 7 separate hunters who swore to him they had shot one of these things. And he came back out of the jungle with plaster casts, audio recordings, hair samples, and 22 pounds of physical evidence he believed would rewrite biology. He went in to disprove a legend. He came out believing it. That is the part that should bother you.
His name was David Oren, a Harvard-trained ornithologist who ran a major Amazon museum. Of everything we've covered on this channel, this is one of the few scientists who stake their reputation on a legend. And stay with me because this gets way more interesting.
Here is why this one is different from every blurry photo story on this channel. His argument was never, look at this footage. It was an anatomy lesson. He took every impossible detail of the legend, the backward feet, the hide that stops bullets, the unbearable stench, and matched each one, feature for feature, to a real animal that science has already pulled out of the ground. That is the claim the title is making, and I'm going to hold it to 3 hard tests. Does the creature actually match the biology? Does the physical evidence survive a laboratory? And could anything that big still be alive in the year we're living in right now? I'm not here to sell you a sloth. I'm here to show you why a serious man couldn't walk away and what it cost him to keep looking. The name is Mapinguari. In a dozen Amazonian languages, it means roughly the same thing. The roaring animal, the fetid beast, the thing you do not follow into the trees. For most of the 20th century, it sat in the same bin as every other jungle bogeyman. A story to keep children near the fire, filed under folklore and ignored by anyone with a degree. And then a man who had no professional reason to care about monsters and every professional reason to avoid them, looked at those descriptions and decided for the first time that they were worth taking literally. So let's do exactly what he did. Let's start with the thing itself, with what people swear they have actually seen. Ask a rubber tapper in the western Amazon to describe the Mapinguari, and you tend to get the same animal with the same disturbing details, told by people who have never met and speak different languages. It stands somewhere around 2 meters tall when it rears up on its hind legs, about the height of a tall man, but built like nothing human. The fur is long and matted, usually described as reddish, sometimes blackish or brown. The arms end in claws that witnesses compare to a giant anteater's, only heavier, the size you'd expect on a giant armadillo. Then come the parts that push it out of the natural world and into nightmare. The smell first, always the smell. People describe a stench so overpowering it makes them dizzy, nauseous, weak in the knees. A mix, they say, of feces and rotting flesh. Some accounts claim the odor alone can knock a person out, which is almost certainly exaggeration. But the consistency of the complaint is hard to ignore. You don't usually invent the same specific, unpleasant detail independently across a continent. Next, the feet. The Mapinguari is said to walk on backward feet. Its tracks point the wrong way, so that if you try to follow it, you walk away from it. There's a round track too, a strange circular impression that doesn't match any forest animal anyone recognizes. And the creature is described as nearly impossible to kill. Hunters say they've put arrows and bullets into it and watched them stop dead against its hide. The only way to bring one down, the stories agree, is a shot to the navel or the face, the one soft place on an armored body. And then there's the detail that gets put on every bad illustration, the mouth in the belly. A second, gaping maw set into the creature's stomach. That one sounds like pure myth, and maybe it is. But sit with the whole package for a second. A huge, slow, reddish, foul-smelling, armored, clawed animal that rears up like a bear, leaves baffling tracks, and shrugs off weapons. Folklorists filed it under monster and moved on. That's the rational call. The descriptions are vivid, they're old, and they come from an environment that produces a lot of fear and a lot of stories. And these aren't all dusty old stories either. When the New York Times went to the Amazon to report on all this in 2007, they spoke to a young man from the Caritiana people named Giovaldo, who described being out hunting near a place his tribe calls the Cave of the Mapinguari. He said something large came toward him through the trees, making a tremendous noise. It stopped close to him, and then, he said, the smell hit. A stench so foul and so strong that it made him dizzy and weak, and he blacked out. When he came to, the thing was gone. His father later walked the area and pointed out the trail of destruction, trampled vines, felled saplings, the path of something heavy that did not care what was in its way. You can dismiss a single account like that easily enough. A frightened young hunter, a strange noise, a story that grows in the telling. But Giovaldo wasn't alone. Another man in his 70s told reporters he'd encountered one decades earlier after a 45-day canoe journey deep into the forest. A hairy thing that walked upright like a man and screamed, and that, thank God, did not come toward him. Tribe after tribe has its own word for the creature. Many of those words translate to the same two ideas over and over, the roaring one and the fetid one, the sound and the smell. Those are the two details that never change. But the thing that always nagged at me and clearly nagged at the man we're about to meet is the consistency. Folklore drifts, tell a scary story across 500 miles of jungle and a few centuries, and the details usually scatter. Here, the core stayed weirdly stable. Same size, same stench, same armor, same backward feet. That kind of stability is either a sign of very good storytelling or a sign that everyone is describing the same actual thing. David Conway Oren was not a monster hunter. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story, so let me lay out exactly who he was. Born in the United States in 1953, he earned his bachelor's degree at Yale in 1975, a master's at Harvard in 1978, and a Harvard doctorate in 1981. His dissertation was a deeply unglamorous study of white sand vegetation in the Amazon. He became a Brazilian citizen, settled in the country, and rose to be director of research at the Museu Paraense Emilio Goeldi in Belém, one of the oldest and most respected scientific institutions in the Amazon. His field was birds. He was, by training and by temperament, an ornithologist, a careful cataloger of feathers and song. When I tell you the title of this video says a real scientist, this is what I mean. Oren wasn't a guy with a website. He was a guy with a museum office, peer-reviewed publications, and a professional reputation he stood to lose. And that's the first thing that makes the Mapinguari story different from almost everything else we cover on this channel.
What David Oren chased here is nothing like the Bigfoot we know from North America. The Brazilian legend is not ape or human-like. It is more monstrous from their description. And because of that, he never said ape. He said sloth. Yes, a giant sloth monster terrifying the local population in a similar manner the way Bigfoot terrifies and fascinates people in North America. But hold on to that, because it cracks open a much bigger door.
Because here's the part I keep coming back to. Oren started out a skeptic. He did not go into the Amazon hoping to find a sloth. For years, he heard the Mapinguari stories the way any working biologist would, as colorful, regional folklore, background noise to the real work of surveying birds. Then, in the Tapajos River Basin, he started actually sitting down with the people telling the stories. Hunters, rubber tappers, indigenous elders. And the more carefully he listened, the more uncomfortable he got. It wasn't the spookiness that got him, it was the specificity. These weren't people describing a vague forest demon. They were describing an animal, its gait, its feeding, its droppings, the way mothers move with young, the seasons it appeared. They were describing it the way a hunter describes game he knows, not the way a storyteller describes a ghost. And the animal they kept describing didn't match anything alive in the Amazon. It matched, in detail after detail, something that was supposed to be extinct. Over the years, he gathered more than 100 of these accounts. He found 7 different hunters who told him independently that they had killed one. He didn't take that at face value. He pressed, he cross-checked, he asked the kind of follow-up questions a trained field scientist asks. And by 1993, he had published a formal paper in the museum's journal with a title that, for a credentialed ornithologist, was an act of professional courage. Did ground sloths survive to recent times in the Amazon region? 8 years later, he doubled down with a second paper. I personally think that conversion arc is the most persuasive thing in this entire case, more than any cast or recording. A skeptic with a reputation does not flip on a whim. Something he heard out there moved him. The question is whether it should move us. Some of what he collected sits right at the blurry edge between testimony and folklore, and I want to show you one of those, because it tells you something about how deep this belief runs. One group of people in a remote river valley told of having captured 2 infant Mapinguaris and tried to raise them, feeding the young creatures on bananas and milk, the way you'd hand-rear an orphaned animal. The story goes that after a year or two, the stench of the growing animals became unbearable, and they were released back into the forest. Now, is that a literal event? I have no idea, and neither did Oren. It might be pure legend. But notice the texture of it. It's not the story you tell about a demon. It's the story you tell about an animal, a difficult, smelly, real animal you tried and failed to keep. That domestic, almost mundane quality is exactly what kept pulling Oren back in. It's worth pausing on where he was working from too. The Goeldi Museum isn't a roadside attraction, it's a research institution founded in the 19th century, with active programs in zoology, botany, and the study of Amazonian peoples. Oren ran its research division. He had access to collections, to fieldwork logistics, to colleagues across disciplines. When he chose to spend that institutional capital on the Mapinguari question, he wasn't a lone eccentric shouting into the trees. He was a senior scientist deciding, with his eyes open, that a piece of folklore was worth real scientific resources. That decision is either the story's greatest strength or its central cautionary tale, and reasonable people land on both sides and make no mistake about what those expeditions cost him. This is not fieldwork you do from the window of a Jeep. Reaching the areas where the accounts clustered meant days, sometimes weeks, of river travel and hard travel on foot, into terrain with no roads, no signal, and no easy way back out. He did it again and again across the better part of a decade on a museum researcher's budget chasing an animal his own colleagues regarded as a fairy tale. Whatever you ultimately conclude about the Mapinguari, you cannot conclude that David Oren was lazy or unserious about the question. He spent real years, real money, and a real slice of his professional standing on it. People do not do that for a creature they secretly know is fiction. They do it because they think they're onto something. Whether he was, is what the rest of this video is going to decide. Here's the move that turns this from a campfire story into something you have to actually think about. Oren took the Mapinguari's impossible features, the ones folklorists wrote off as fantasy, and translated each one into the language of paleontology. And every time he did, a monster trait turned into a known fact about an extinct animal. Watch how this works, because it's genuinely clever. Start with the backward feet. Ground sloths didn't walk on the flat of their feet the way we do. Their enormous claws forced them to walk on the sides and outer edges of their feet, with the claws curled under. The footprints this produces are bizarre, lopsided, inward rotated, easy to misread. In fact, real fossilized ground sloth trackways have genuinely been mistaken by people for giant human footprints pointing the wrong way. The backward feet of legend, Oren argued, is exactly what you'd get if untrained people tried to read the tracks of an animal that walked like that. Now the armor, the part where bullets and arrows bounce off. This one is almost too good. Many ground sloths, especially the mylodonts, had what are called osteoderms, small plates of bone embedded directly in their skin, forming a kind of flexible chainmail under the fur. We have actual preserved sloth skin with these bony nodules in it, sitting in museums right now. A spear or an arrow hitting a hide reinforced with embedded bone really might glance off. The invulnerable monster of the legend maps onto a documented anatomical feature of the real animal. Keep going. The strange round track that doesn't fit any forest animal? Oren suggested it's the imprint of the tip of a heavy, dragging tail. Ground sloths had massive tails they sometimes used as a prop, like a tripod when they reared up to feed. The dung? Witnesses said Mapinguari droppings look like a horse's. Fossilized ground sloth dung does in fact closely resemble horse dung. Even the dreaded mouth in the belly has a candidate explanation. A misread of the animal's huge chest and abdominal musculature seen through shaggy fur or its paler underbelly, by someone who saw it for a terrified half-second and filled in the rest. Do you see what he did? One by one, the features that made the Mapinguari sound like nonsense became evidence that someone at some point was looking at a real ground sloth. He even refined the theory over time. The hunter's descriptions of certain features pushed him from one sloth family toward another. This is the heart of the title's claim, and I want to be fair to it. This is not a man pointing at a blurry photo and shouting. This is a trained biologist building a structured, testable argument from comparative anatomy. Every piece of the monster has a fossil that fits, which means one of two things is true. Either this really is the answer, or it's the most elegant trap in all of cryptozoology. An idea so internally consistent that it feels true whether or not it is. And to be clear about what we're even talking about, the ground sloths were one of the great success stories of South American evolution. This wasn't one animal, it was a whole sprawling family of them. Dozens of species, ranging in size from things you could wrestle to the largest land mammals the continent ever produced. At the top end sat Megatherium, the giant ground sloth proper, an animal that could reach the size of a modern elephant, 4 tons of muscle and claw, tall enough on its hind legs to pull branches out of the canopy. There were medium ones the rough size of a bear or an ox. There was even, bizarrely, a branch of the family that took to the sea along the Pacific coast. These animals were everywhere, in every size class, for millions of years. They're not some obscure footnote you have to squint to believe in. They dominated the place. Oren's Mapinguari wasn't the elephant-sized megatherium, to be fair. The descriptions point to something smaller, in the range of a couple hundred kilos, which actually lines up better with certain medium-sized members of the family. That's part of why he kept adjusting which specific group he thought it belonged to. To a skeptic, that flexibility looks like a theory bending to fit whatever the latest witness said. To a defender, it looks like a scientist refining a hypothesis as new data comes in, which is, after all, what science is supposed to do. I'll let you decide which read is fairer, but either way, the raw material of his argument, a diverse, long-lived family of large, clawed, armored, slow-moving herbivores that genuinely lived in South America, is not in dispute. The fossils are in the museums. The only question is the date on the last one. Before we judge Oren, you need to know he wasn't the first serious scientist to fall for exactly this idea, and the first time around, it didn't end well. Rewind to 1895 to the far south of the continent in Patagonia. A German rancher named Hermann Eberhard was exploring a cave near an inlet called Last Hope Sound in what's now Chile. Inside, he found a large piece of animal hide, and it looked fresh, thick, hair still attached, studded with those little bony nodules. It looked like it had been peeled off something that died recently. Word spread. Naturalists made the long journey to see it. Pieces of the hide ended up in museums in Argentina and Sweden. And in 1898, a giant of South American science, the paleontologist Florentino Ameghino, examined a fragment and made a thunderclap announcement. This was the skin of a mylodon, a giant ground sloth. And given how fresh it looked, the animal must still be alive in the Patagonian interior. He gave the living creature a brand new scientific name, Neomylodon listae. He tied it to local Tehuelche accounts. One indigenous man even claimed to have shot one. A former provincial governor swore a shaggy, red-haired beast had crossed his path years earlier and shrugged off his rifle rounds.
Stop me if this sounds familiar. Fresh-looking evidence, a credentialed scientist, local hunters who say they shot one. We are watching the exact same movie, 100 years apart.
The world went a little mad for it. London's Daily Express newspaper actually funded an expedition to go to Patagonia and bring back a living giant sloth. Reports trickled in, a traveler who claimed he'd fired at one, an expedition supposedly attacked by a mylodon-like animal. For a few years around 1900, the idea that a living Ice Age sloth was waiting to be found in South America was taken seriously in the pages of respectable scientific journals. The Zoological Society of London devoted an evening to debating that single piece of skin. And then it collapsed, because the skeptics asked one quiet, devastating question. How do we know the hide is fresh? Caves like that one are cold, dark, and dry, close to ideal natural preservatives. A piece of skin could look fresh after thousands of years in those conditions. When radiocarbon dating finally came along, that's exactly what it confirmed. The famous Mylodon hide was thousands of years old. The animal had been dead since the end of the Ice Age. The fresh-looking skin had fooled some of the best scientific minds of the era. Even the governor eventually admitted the creature he'd seen was probably too small to be a giant sloth at all. I bring this up not to mock anyone, those were good scientists working with what they had. I bring it up because it's the pattern. This is the shape cryptozoology almost always takes, a piece of evidence that's tantalizingly close, a credentialed believer, a flurry of expeditions, and then a slow deflation when the hard test arrives. If you watched our Yeti and Soviet expedition pieces, you've seen this exact arc before. The hair sample that turns out to be a bear. The footprint that turns out to be melt distorted. The Patagonia ghost is the warning label on the entire Mapinguari story. Keep it in mind for the next section because now we have to ask the hard question about Oren's own evidence. And if you want to know how deep this particular obsession runs in the history of science, go back even further, to one of the founding fathers of the United States. When Thomas Jefferson got his hands on some giant fossil claws from a Virginia cave in the 1790s, he assumed they belonged to an enormous living lion he named Megalonyx, Great Claw. It was actually a ground sloth, and Jefferson, who genuinely believed nature didn't let its creations go extinct, instructed Lewis and Clark as they set off to explore the American West in 1804 to keep an eye out for the living animal. A sitting vice president, soon to be president, sent the most famous expedition in American history into the wilderness, partly hoping they'd come back with a living giant sloth. They didn't, of course. But the dream that these animals might still be out there is not some modern internet invention. It is more than 200 years old, and it has caught smarter people than you or me. Let's lay Oren's evidence out on the table, honestly, piece by piece, and ask what each one is actually worth. Because this is where the honest analysis part of this channel earns its keep, and where the title's phrase, "Here's his evidence," has to be handled with care. He had the eyewitness testimony, over 100 accounts, 7 self-reported kills. That's the strongest part of the case and also the weakest, because testimony, no matter how consistent, is not a specimen. He had plaster casts of footprints, including those strange round tail prints and the inward curled claw tracks. He had audio recordings of a long, low, thunderous roar he couldn't match to any known Amazonian animal. He had video of trees clawed and stripped at a height that would require something very large. And he had the physical samples, hair, and around 22 pounds of dung that he hoped to compare at the DNA level against the blood of living tree sloths. On paper, that's an impressive haul. It's vastly more than most cryptids ever generate. So here's the question that decides everything. What happened when it went to the lab? At one point, Oren teamed up with an actual ground sloth specialist, a paleontologist with the United States National Park Service named Greg McDonald, for a Discovery Channel expedition into the basin. They had a plan to lure the animal using sounds Oren believed would draw it in. They broadcast the calls into the forest and waited. Nothing answered. On that same kind of effort, a local guide identified a dung sample as likely Mapinguari. It went for DNA testing. The result came back, anteater. That word should land hard, so let me sit on it. The single most testable piece of physical evidence, the thing that could have rewritten biology, turned out to be the droppings of a giant anteater, an animal everyone already knew was there. And it wasn't a one-off. Across the board, the physical samples that could be identified came back as known animals. Hair attributed to the Mapinguari turned out to belong to giant anteaters, or to ordinary modern sloths. The casts are suggestive but unverifiable. The audio is haunting but unmatched, which is not the same as unmatchable. Nothing in the pile resolved into a new species. The casts and the clawed trees sit in a frustrating middle ground, and they deserve a fair word too. Oren did pour molds of large footprints, including the inward curled claw impressions and the round tail prints his theory actually predicted, and he filmed trees scarred and stripped high off the ground, higher than a person could comfortably reach. To a believer, that's a body of trace evidence that lines up suspiciously well with sloth biology. To a skeptic, it's the exact problem with trace evidence. A footprint can be faked, mislabeled, or simply made by something ordinary and read wrong. And a clawed tree could be the work of any number of known Amazonian animals. None of it can be sequenced. None of it can be put in a cage. A cast is a copy of an absence, and an absence, however striking the shape of it, is not an animal. The audio deserves its own moment because of all the evidence. It's the piece that still gives people chills. Oren came back with a recording of a sound he described as a long, rolling, thunderous roar, a minute or more of it that he could not match to any animal he knew, and he knew the fauna of that forest as well as anyone alive. That sounds compelling, and emotionally it is. But here's the honest problem with mystery audio. "I can't identify it" is a statement about the limits of the listener, not proof of a new animal. The Amazon is a cathedral of strange noise. Howler monkeys alone produce sounds that visitors swear must come from something enormous and demonic. An unmatched recording is a good reason to keep listening. It is not a specimen, and Oren, to his credit, never claimed it was one. And the bottom line, the one I promised you at the very start, there is no body, no skeleton, no captured animal, no clear photograph, no confirmed DNA of an unknown sloth. If there were, this wouldn't be a video on a cryptid channel, it would be the biggest zoological discovery in a century, and Oren would have a statue. I personally think the dung result is the quietest, most damning detail in the whole story. Not because it proves the Mapinguari isn't real, absence of proof isn't proof of absence, but because it's the exact moment the Patagonia pattern repeats. The tantalizing sample, the hard test, the deflation, we have been here before. Now I want to give Oren's idea its strongest possible footing, because there's a piece of this that is not folklore, not testimony, not a contested cast. It's peer-reviewed paleontology, and it's genuinely startling. It's the reason the word survived earns its place in the title. Here's the standard story you've probably heard. The giant ground sloths died out at the end of the last ice age, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, swept away in the same great extinction that took the mammoths and the saber-toothed cats across the Americas. And on the mainland of North and South America, that's true. But the mainland isn't the whole story, and this is the part most people have never heard. On the islands of the Caribbean, Cuba, Hispaniola, ground sloths did not die out 10,000 years ago. They kept going for thousands of years longer. Researchers radiocarbon-dated sloth remains from a cave in Cuba and found the animals had survived to at least around 6,000 years ago, and later work on a tooth pushed the youngest date to roughly 4,200 years ago, 5,000 to 6,000 years longer than their mainland cousins. That's not a fringe claim. It was published in the Proceedings of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. The Caribbean ground sloth is, by the hard evidence, an Ice Age animal that survived the Ice Age by millennia. Let that recalibrate your sense of what's possible. And notice the chilling little correlation buried in the dates. The sloths held on in the Caribbean right up until humans arrived on those islands, and then, within a window of 1,000 years or so, they were gone. The pattern points a quiet finger. Where there were no people, the sloths lasted. When people showed up, the clock started running out. That's the leading explanation for why they vanished at all. That correlation sits at the center of one of the biggest arguments in paleontology, and it's worth understanding because it bears directly on Oren's idea. Why did the great Ice Age animals, the sloths, the mammoths, the giant armadillos, die out when they did? Broadly, there are two camps. One says climate. The world warmed at the end of the Ice Age, habitats shifted, and the big specialists couldn't keep up. The other says us, that as humans spread across the Americas, we hunted the slow-breeding giants faster than they could replace themselves, the so-called overkill hypothesis. The Caribbean data is such a powerful clue precisely because it lets you separate the two. The climate changed on those islands at the same time as everywhere else, but the sloths there didn't die until people arrived thousands of years later. That's about as close to a natural experiment as deep time ever gives you, and it tilts hard toward humans as the trigger. Now follow that logic where Oren followed it. If what kills ground sloths is people, not warmth, not the wrong trees, but human pressure, then the safest place for a ground sloth to survive would be precisely the place humans almost never go. And the deep interior of the Amazon is, even now, one of the least penetrated landscapes on the planet. Whole indigenous groups live there in voluntary isolation, uncontacted. New species of monkey, of bird, of fish turn up in that forest with genuine regularity. Oren's reasoning, stripped to its bones, was this. The thing that doomed the sloths everywhere else is the one thing that great green wilderness has least of. It's not a crazy chain of logic, it's a careful one. It just runs past the point the evidence can follow.
So here is the question I can't stop turning over. If, for the people of the Amazon, this is a lost ancient species that quietly survived, then could our North American Bigfoot be the very same kind of story? Of course, not a sloth monster, but remember, all creatures back then were pretty much giant. So could a giant ape-like creature survived? A relic that outlived its own age, still in the present.
So here's the honest scorecard on the word survived. Did Ice Age ground sloths outlive the Ice Age? Yes, provably by thousands of years. Did they do it in the Amazon, into the present day in the form Oren described? That's the leap, and it's a big one. The confirmed late survival happened on isolated islands, not in a continental rainforest, and it ended 4,000 years ago. Oren's hypothesis takes a real, documented phenomenon, sloths surviving far later than the textbook says, and stretches it across a much bigger gap. The science gives him the principle. It does not give him the animal. But you can see, can't you, why a careful man might look at that Caribbean date and think, if 5,000 years, why not more? If an island, why not the largest, least explored forest on the planet? I've spent 6 sections building the strongest case I honestly can for Oren's idea. Now I owe you the other side at full strength because the mainstream verdict on the living Mapinguari is not maybe. Among working zoologists, it's a fairly firm no, and the reasons are good ones. Start with the simplest and hardest problem. Population. A single animal can't exist. For a species to persist for thousands of years, you need a breeding population, hundreds probably, of large animals, eating, mating, dying, and reproducing across generations. Animals the size of a Mapinguari eat enormous quantities of vegetation and leave enormous traces. Hundreds of 200-kilo herbivores cannot move through a forest like ghosts. There should be bones, there should be carcasses, roadkill near the expanding frontier, fresh dung that DNA tests as something new remains in the bellies of jaguars. We don't have any of it. The forest is vast, yes, but it's not empty, and it's shrinking and being surveyed more every year. Then there's the camera problem, and it's a brutal one in our era. We are saturated with lenses, camera traps, blanket conservation areas. Researchers, loggers, miners, soldiers, tourists, and indigenous communities all carry phones. We routinely photograph some of the rarest, shyest animals on Earth. And in all of that coverage, across decades, we have not one clear, verifiable image of a living ground sloth. The skeptic's point is blunt. Extraordinary animals leave ordinary evidence eventually. This one never has. There's also a pointed critique of the whole enterprise. The skeptic and science writer Brian Dunning devoted an episode of his podcast to walking through exactly why the ground sloth hypothesis doesn't hold together as a claim about a living animal. And the late paleontologist Paul Martin made a sharper, more uncomfortable observation about cryptozoology in general, that its enthusiasts are drawn, like the public, to big, charismatic creatures, megafauna, far more than to the small, unglamorous animals that actually do still turn up undiscovered. We want the monster to be huge and dramatic. That desire should make us more careful, not less. Paleontologists have weighed in directly too. On the Science Skeptic podcast circuit, the ground sloth specialist Richard Farina has gone through the real fossil record of these animals and measured it against the legend, and the fit, once you get past the broad strokes, gets shakier the harder you look. So let me be straight, because the title might tempt you the other way. I do not think there is a living giant ground sloth in the Amazon. The weight of biological evidence is heavily against it, and the people whose job it is to know are nearly unanimous. If this video stopped here, the honest verdict would be, beautiful idea, almost certainly not a living animal. And here's the cruel irony that the skeptics point out, the one that really seals it for me. The Amazon does keep coughing up new species. Oren was right about that. But look at what they are. A new monkey, a new bird, a new fish, a new frog, a new beetle. Small things, quiet things, things that can live and die in a few hundred square meters of canopy without anyone noticing. The forest hides the small beautifully. What it does not do, what no forest does, is hide the enormous. We have never once discovered a hidden population of elephant-scale or even bear-scale mammals lurking undetected into the modern age. The pattern of real discovery runs in exactly the opposite direction from what the Mapinguari needs. The bigger the animal, the harder it is to hide, and the Mapinguari is described as very, very big. But the video doesn't stop here, because there's a third position, and it's the one I find both the most likely and honestly the most haunting. It threads between living animal and pure myth, and it comes from someone every bit as credentialed as Oren. His name is Glenn Shepard, an anthropologist and ethnobiologist, trained at Princeton and Berkeley, who has spent over 30 years doing fieldwork with indigenous peoples of the Amazon, and who, as it happens, also ended up at the Goeldi Museum. Like Oren, Shepard started out a skeptic about the Mapinguari. Then, in 1997, while working with the Mapinguari people in the Peruvian Amazon, he heard them describe a creature they call the Segamai, a cow-sized, foul-smelling, bulletproof animal with a long snout that lives in remote rocky country and roars. He recognized it instantly. It was the Mapinguari, by another name, told by a people hundreds of miles away. What makes Shepard's account so striking is how matter-of-fact his informants were. To them, the Segamai wasn't a spirit or a god. Those exist in their world too, and they're described very differently. The Segamai was just another animal of the forest, slotted into the same mental category as tapirs and peccaries and monkeys, only rarer and more dangerous. It ate certain plants, it lived in certain places, it behaved in certain ways. That ordinariness is the tell. People file the supernatural and the natural in different drawers, and across multiple Amazonian cultures, the Mapinguari keeps getting filed in the drawer marked real animal, right next to the creatures we can walk into a zoo and see. And Shepard's interpretation is the one I keep coming back to. He doesn't think a ground sloth is alive out there. He thinks the descriptions are too consistent, too anatomically specific to be invented, and that the best explanation is that they are a memory. A real memory of a real animal, carried in oral tradition across an almost unimaginable span of time. Not a story about a monster, a story about an animal people actually saw and then kept describing accurately long after the last one died. Think about what that would mean. We know from the Caribbean dates that ground sloths and humans overlapped in the Americas for thousands of years. The first people to enter South America almost certainly saw living ground sloths on the mainland, hunted them, feared them, told their children about them. If even a thread of that memory survived in oral tradition, passed mouth to mouth down hundreds of generations, then the Mapinguari isn't a hoax and isn't a living animal. It's something stranger than either. The longest-running eyewitness report on Earth. A description of an Ice Age beast kept alive by human voices for 10,000 years after the beast itself was bones. This is also where I want to plant a flag, the same one we plant every time this channel touches indigenous knowledge. These traditions deserve to be taken seriously as evidence, not waved off as superstition. The people of the Amazon were not confused. They may, in fact, be the most reliable witnesses in this entire story, just to an event much older than anyone assumed. I personally think this is the likeliest answer, and I think it's more beautiful than a living sloth would be. A living monster is a zoology problem. A 10,000-year-old memory is a miracle of human storytelling. So let's run the three lenses back now that we've seen everything and total it up the way an honest jury would. No thumb on the scale. Lens 1, the creature. Does the description match a real animal? Suspiciously well. The backward feet, the armor, the tail track, the dung, the size, every strange feature has a clean paleontological match. That's real, and it's the strongest thing the case has going for it. But matches a real animal cuts both ways. It supports a living sloth, and it equally supports an accurate ancient memory of a dead one. A perfect anatomical fit doesn't tell you which. Lens 2, the physical evidence. Does any of it hold up? No. This is where the case falls apart as a claim about a living creature. The dung was an anteater's. The hair was anteater or modern sloth. The lure drew nothing. There is no body, no skeleton, no clear photo, no confirmed DNA. A decade of dedicated effort by a trained scientist produced nothing that survives a laboratory. That's not a small gap. In zoology, that's the whole ballgame. Lens 3, survival. Is it biologically possible? Late survival, yes, provably. The Caribbean sloths make that undeniable. Present-day survival of a large breeding population in the Amazon, undetected in the camera age, almost certainly not. The math of populations and the saturation of modern observation are simply too heavy to push aside. Add it up and you get a verdict that refuses to be simple, which is exactly why I find it worth 7,000 words. Is there a living giant ground sloth in the Amazon? Almost certainly not, and I won't pretend otherwise. Was David Oren a crank? Absolutely not. He was a serious scientist, building a serious, testable argument that happened to fail its hardest test. And is the Mapinguari just a myth? That's the one I'd push back on hardest. The evidence points towards something richer than myth, a real animal, remembered with eerie precision, long after it was gone. The monster may be extinct. The memory may be the most ancient true thing the Amazon still holds. David Oren died in 2023. He spent the back half of a distinguished scientific career chasing an animal he never caught, and he took a real professional risk to do it. It would be easy to file him under smart man who fooled himself, and maybe that's the tidy ending. But I don't think it's the honest one. Oren did something most scientists never dare. He followed an uncomfortable idea all the way out to its edge, gathered everything he could, published it under his own name, and let the evidence land where it landed. The evidence didn't vindicate him. The courage still counts. And he left the rest of us with a genuinely good question, which is the best thing a scientist can leave. Not, is there a monster in the woods? But something deeper. How long can a memory live? Could a description outlast the thing it describes by 10,000 years? Could the people of the Amazon be carrying in their oldest stories a snapshot of the Ice Age more accurate than anything in our museums? If they are, then the Mapinguari is real, just not in the way the thumbnail promised. It's real the way a fingerprint is real after the hand is gone. The Amazon is the one place on Earth still big enough to keep a secret this size. 2 million square miles, much of it never walked by a scientist. I don't think it's hiding a living ground sloth, but I'm honest enough to admit that I don't think so is not the same as I know. And that thin, uncomfortable gap between those two phrases, that's where every story on this channel lives.
But the strange creature found in the Amazon is not the only one. It seems elusive species all around the world are hiding from us. And if you want to find out more, consider checking this video out on the screen right now.